Ukraine has a commitment problem of its own right, in the sense that no government probably in Kyiv can survive any sort of ceasefire with Russia, precisely because it's just so unpopular. I think the Russian government also knows this. And so from the perspective of both sides, there's really no deal to be had there. That's not to say that they're not talking. That's not to say that there's no negotiation between them. I'm just saying that the prospects of a viable long-term settlement to conclude this war is very remote.
Thanks for tuning in to the CDA Institute's expert series. We recently welcomed back Alexander Lanoszka for an update on the war in Ukraine. We discussed prospects for a negotiated settlement, whether the recent Poland missile strike reveals anything about NATO solidarity, what implications a war over Taiwan would have for Western support of Ukraine, the potential consequences of war fatigue, Putin's survival, and finally, how Canada can continue supporting Ukraine's war effort. Alexander Lanoszka is an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Waterloo. He studies alliance politics, theories of war, and European security. Alexander, great to have you back. Thanks for joining me today for this discussion. U.S. General Mark Milley recently stated that Ukraine's prospects of vanquishing Russia in battle are not high and suggested that it should consider negotiating with the Kremlin. What do you make of this assessment? Would you agree or disagree?
I obviously do not have the intelligence or the privileged information that General Milley has. He might be seeing things that, well, for sure he is seeing things that I'm not seeing. That being said, even in the run-up to the launch of the full-scale invasion in February, there were these sorts of statements made by leading military leaders in the United States, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere that cast significant doubt on the ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to resist the any sort of attack launched by Russia. That obviously has been proven very false. And I think that the fact that those sets of predictions have turned out to be flawed should induce a little bit more humility. We don't really know what to expect because war is very much contingent. Anything could possibly happen, although certain things are much more likely than others. I would say that Ukraine has proved itself to be very resilient and very capable in fighting against Russia on the battlefield. I think that if it is supplied with certain platforms and sees its ammunition stocks replenished, then there's no reason to think that it cannot push back Russian forces to those lines in the war seen on the 23rd of February. And indeed, Ukraine is still taking territory even after the triumph that was long overdue in the city of Kherson not that long ago. Whether Ukraine can take the fight further and restore the status quo antebellum that existed prior to 2014, that is another question. But as regards to the territory seized by Russia since the 24th of February, Ukraine seems to be doing a fairly capable job in liberating that territory. Maybe not as fast as people would like, but it's certainly doing it. Ukraine at the moment has put forward conditions for any sort of negotiated settlement. And indeed, this war will have to end at one point, and most wars, including the two world wars, did end in a negotiated settlement, even though, of course, military defeat on the battlefield were the catalysts for those settlements taking place. That being said, the fundamental problem that undermines the possibility of a settlement here is that Russia makes assurances or promises that it then goes on to break. And as long as Russian troops are on Ukrainian territory, Ukraine has very few assurances that Russia will not use any sort of ceasefire in order to regroup or consolidate its position on that territory. So long as that basic commitment problem exists, I think this war will continue. And for that matter, Ukraine has a commitment problem of its own right, in the sense that no government probably in Kyiv can survive any sort of ceasefire with Russia, precisely because it's just so unpopular. I think the Russian government also knows this. And so from the perspective of both sides, there's really no deal to be had there. That's not to say that they're not talking. That's not to say that there's no negotiation between them. I'm just saying that the prospects of a viable long-term settlement to conclude this war is very remote. Of course, they're going to still strike deals about the provision, or pardon me, the transfer of grain out of Ukraine, or even exchanges involving prisoners of war. There'll still be conversations between the two governments, even if they're not necessarily taking place center stage. The prospects, however, of a major negotiated settlement remain still very elusive.
Do you think NATO's response to the Poland missile strike revealed anything about its solidarity? If the war spilled over into NATO territory again, do you think there would be a more unified response?
I think the main lesson to draw from the incident at Przewodów was that governments within NATO are very keen on making the right decision in view of the risks and costs involved, particularly because there's such a hot war waging between Russia and Ukraine. The Polish government was very careful at the outset when news reports indicated that there were fatalities in that village due possibly to Russian strike. And indeed, in the hours after the disclosure of that particular incident, the Polish government was careful to resist any immediate conclusions to the effect that it was a targeted attack involving some sort of Russian missile strike. That the language adopted by the Polish Ministry of Affairs, when it finally issued an official statement, allowed for the possibility of a Ukrainian interceptor having gone astray, albeit, of course, in the context of the massive missile attack that Russia had launched on that particular day. So I think that particular event reveals that even Poland, which has a reputation, perhaps unfairly, of being Russophobic and trigger happy, was keen on trying to collect as much information as possible, to confer with its allies, to consider carefully the merits of invoking particular clauses of the Washington Treaty, and to come to what was ultimately a sensible decision. Now, of course, there were some within Poland, or even without Poland, calling for a very strong response on the presumption that indeed Russia was responsible for the attack. But I think that it really goes to show that governments within NATO are not at all hot-headed as often presumed, that they are very keen on managing escalation risk precisely because of the stakes involved here.
To what extent should we be concerned about war fatigue, given the fears of escalation and potential for a winter energy crisis in Europe? Furthermore, is it possible that an escalation over Taiwan in the future could force NATO allies to divert their attentions and resources from Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific?
I think war fatigue is a very real possibility. We are seeing some exhaustion with the issue. I think even a number of observers who, like myself, might not necessarily have such a strong personal attachment to Ukraine feel exhausted, because the news has been relentless and it's been very demanding on our attention, to say nothing of all the emotions that come with such a intensive war as this one. And so I think if individuals like myself feel exhausted, I can only imagine how those who are much less keyed into this particular news story or historical event would feel. That is definitely a likelihood that should be taken seriously. That being said, it still seems that governments across NATO are keen on providing the necessary support for Ukraine to, at the very least, not lose. And in some cases, we are seeing countries step up their military assistance to Ukraine, perhaps with the goal of allowing Ukraine to expand its chances of not just not losing, but of winning as well. Sweden, for instance, has recently stepped up its military assistance. The Biden administration has also pledged to carry over a lot of the support that it has been showing thus far, notwithstanding some House Republicans. The United Kingdom has promised to match its monetary assistance, or the assistance valued in monetary terms, in 2023 to that which was seen in 2022. So governments still have their eye on the ball, notwithstanding some of the public exhaustion that we might start seeing. And even with respect to the energy crisis that might be rolling Europe this winter, it's not going to be as significant as initially feared, precisely because Europe has been adapting, it has been importing loads of liquefied natural gas, it has filled a lot of its gas storage in a manner that few had anticipated. For Ukrainians, of course, this story is going to be much different. The winter is going to be very difficult, considering that Russia has made a concerted effort to target critical energy infrastructure. Yet, as much as Ukrainians are going to be facing a very difficult winter, they still seem to be very much resolved to see through it on the premise that life is better without electricity than life with Russia. As to the question on Taiwan, I think what this whole military escalation, this episode of Russia's military escalation against Ukraine and all of the military assistance that it precipitated from various NATO countries, I think all of that exposes how Western governments have been very much underprepared for the provisioning of ammunition for highly intense combat operations of the sort that Ukraine has been fighting. We already had suspicions that, for instance, a country like France would only be able to maintain a high operational tempo in intensive combat operations for about a week against a pure adversary. That is obviously not acceptable. And indeed, the United States, the United Kingdom, and various other NATO partners have been really digging deep into their own ammunition stocks and other stockpiles to support Ukraine. That might create a degree of exposure as regards to Taiwan. Taiwan, however, is different because, unlike Ukraine, quite frankly, Taiwan has not done a good job of addressing its core security needs in a manner that is appropriate to the situation that it faces. And so the issue for Taiwan is not so much that Western governments might not have the wherewithal to support it. The fact of the matter is the Taiwanese government might not necessarily have the same wherewithal to resist a very determined Chinese invasion in the same way that the Ukrainians did prior to February of this year.
You mentioned in your recent MLI commentary paper that Canada could have helped Europe reduce its reliance on Russian hydrocarbons. Since Ottawa produces 16.1 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily, are there still opportunities to alleviate European energy shortages? Also, considering the challenges Ukrainians will face this winter, is there a role Canada can play in helping them pull through in the coming months?
I think Canada certainly missed its opportunity here to do so. It could, of course, make up for that lost time by investing in infrastructure that will allow it to export liquefied natural gas. Germany has already built some infrastructure to import liquefied natural gas, despite all the roadblocks that developing that infrastructure would generally entail. I think even if it's not destined for European markets, there's still an interest for Canada to invest in this sort of infrastructure. Europe is taking a lot of liquefied natural gas that might be actually going to other customers elsewhere in the world. And so by driving up the price because of that expanded demand, other less prosperous customers are finding themselves in short supply. And so with these dynamics afoot, Canada really could have and could still in the future play a role in augmenting not just the energy security of its European allies in NATO, but more generally throughout the market. I think one critical area that really demands a lot more attention is the provision of spare parts, component parts, and power generators, and anything that companies like DTEK in Ukraine would find absolutely essential to ensure that they can repair damaged equipment and whatever else has suffered in recent missile attacks undertaken by Russia as regards to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This issue may not be as newsworthy as, say, the provision of military assistance, but precisely because Canada might not necessarily have that much more to give because of how years of underinvestment and underspending have constrained Canada's ability to provide necessary military assistance, Canada can still provide these other forms of assistance that would certainly be very useful for Ukraine. And unlike military assistance, to the extent that there were ever these sorts of concerns about military escalation, end use diversion, and so forth, the things that have constrained various NATO governments from providing platforms to Ukraine, these sorts of considerations are certainly absent as regards to the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. There's a very valid need for providing this sort of assistance, not least because it will tangibly alleviate a lot of the suffering and hardship that Ukrainians are surely going to experience over the course of the next several months.
Reports are coming in saying that Putin has been unable to placate competing factions in Russia who are putting pressure on his regime. What are the prospects for his survival depending on the war's outcome? And could there be backlash from the Russian elite?
Revolutions are inherently unpredictable. If you can predict a revolution, then chances are you can take steps to mitigate the likelihood of that revolution from ever taking place. And so it becomes a self-defeating prophecy of sorts. I suspect that Putin's hold on power remains very secure. In fact, despite many expert commentaries saying that the loss of Kherson would be absolutely humiliating to Putin and how its military defeat there would be absolutely damaging to his regime's prospects, it seems like, quite frankly, ordinary Russians do not care, that they don't necessarily see the annexation of those territories or the attempted annexation of those territories to be top of mind. We don't see any major pressure on Putin himself. That being said, he's still very much nervous. We see his motorcades driving at high speeds, for example, in Moscow, as if to escape any sort of attempt on his body. We are seeing some infighting within the security services within Russia, but again, such infighting seems to be taking place in a manner that leaves Putin largely immune. It's mostly a struggle between Prigozhin, who heads Wagner, and Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. And indeed, we are seeing on social media ordinary Russians appealing to Putin to help address some of the problems that Russia has faced as regards to its economy and military performance. Even though Putin certainly bears the lion's share of responsibility for all these things, nevertheless, Russians are looking to him to help resolve these issues as if the problem lies really elsewhere. The problem is not in the center, and it really calls to mind an old saying about Russian politics that the Tsar is never wrong, that it's really his subordinates that are up to no good, that the Tsar only wants what is best, and that if there are problems, then it's because his subordinates are not implementing his will as well as they should.